This film begins with a guy named Dan who works at a used car dealership in Buffalo, New York. At that time he's really good at selling cars and is known as the best salesman there. One day his boss asked him to take a picture for the company website, but he said no because he wanted to celebrate his wedding anniversary with his wife Jessica. Dan is a hardworking guy who plans his life carefully and even has a schedule at home. When he got home he greeted his wife Jessica and their 3 kids, Nina, Kyle and Max. At that time Jessica was having a disagreement with Nina about where she wanted to go to college. Nina had initially planned to go to Stanford University for journalism but changed her mind to go to Southern University with her boyfriend Trevor. Then Jessica asked Dan to talk to Nina, but she stuck to her decision. Later Dan wanted to go out with Jessica for their 18th wedding anniversary, and asked Kyle to take care of Max. However, Kyle had other plans and refused. He passed the responsibility to his older sister Nina, who was upset about it. Eventually she felt better thinking about studying at the same college as Trevor. Meanwhile Kyle met his friend Samir, and found out that instead of doing group work, they were playing online games in Samir's garage. After Kyle paid him some money, surprisingly Kyle is a well-known gamer on the internet with the user named Killboy, and has lots of fans. Now let's talk about Dan and Jessica, who went to an amusement park. Jessica was a bit upset with Dan because he always stuck to his boring plans, and she wanted him to take the family on a trip out of town. After enjoying a few rides together he promised to plan a family vacation. Hearing that Jessica was happy with this idea, and while they were kissing, a group of teenage boys at the amusement park secretly took photos and teased them. Knowing that, Dan asked the teenagers to delete the photo of them kissing, but one of them accidentally spilled his drink on Dan's head. Instead of fighting with them, Dan chose to walk away from the situation. The next day Jessica was practicing boxing to release her frustrations as a stay-at-home mom dealing with various problems, including difficulties in advising her daughter Nina. While she was practicing she accidentally hit another woman named Gwen who was also of boxing at that time. They started talking and Jessica apologized for her actions, explaining that she was frustrated because her husband never invited the family for holidays or spent time together outside the home. After chatting for a bit, Gwen had to leave for the airport because she was a tour guide. She gave Jessica her business card and said she could contact her anytime if she planned to go on vacation. Meanwhile Dan was shopping at a supermarket with Max when a stranger suddenly attacked him. Dan quickly defended himself, surprising everyone in the supermarket. He paid for his groceries as if nothing had happened, and later went home where he had a secret drawer with weapons under the stairs. Worried, he contacted his friend Augie and asked him to create new identities for him and his family. Shortly after Dan took Max to Nina's school. He went to the school magazine editor's room to find Nina, but she wasn't there. Then he talked to a student who revealed that Nina had left the school magazine 3 months ago, and was hanging out with her friends. Under the stadium Dan met his daughter and expressed his disappointment for not telling him about leaving the school magazine community. Nina, who was also upset, explained that she left because her dad never read her articles. He then asked Nina to come with him, and when he went to pick up Kyle from his chess class, he found out that Kyle was playing online games at Samir's garage. Knowing that, he scolded Kyle and told him to get in the car. Once all his kids were in the car, Dan hurried to pick up Jessica, who worked at the hospital. He told them that they were going on vacation to Las Vegas, just like Jessica had always wanted. Meanwhile, a black man was following Dan and his family. When Dan noticed this, he tried to outsmart the van and avoid being chased. He drove the car at high speed. Without telling his family about the situation, he took the car to his workplace showroom and lifted it. Finding a listening device underneath secretly, Dan attached the listening device to a car that his coworker was going to test. He then suggested that his coworker drive the test car at high speed to figure out what was wrong with it. The people in the black van who were monitoring Dan's car were fooled and chased after the car driven by Dan's coworker. After things got safer, Dan continued their journey to Las Vegas when Jessica was about to share photos of their trip. Dan gathered all the cell phones they had and threw them under a bridge. He didn't want any communication devices during the holiday as he was worried about people tracking them. At the American Automobile Association office, Dan tried to get a map for their trip. The officer at the office was hesitant because Dan didn't want to pay with a credit card. However, he gave the officer some cash as a bribe, and the officer finally provided them with the maps they needed. Soon after, they continued their journey, even though it was a bit awkward at first because they were used to being busy with their gadgets, but soon they all started singing and laughing together to make the trip more enjoyable. Back at Dan's house, a man named Caffrey and his 3 men were trying to find Dan's family. It wasn't easy because there was no record of their credit card usage or any social media posts from Dan's family. Shortly after, Caffrey ordered his men to keep looking for Dan's family and felt that Dan hadn't told them his true identity. When Dan was at a hotel, he changed his mind about staying there after he saw Kyle taking a photo with a fan and posting it on social media. He told his family to keep going, so his wife and kids had to sleep in the car that night. Soon 3 of McCaffrey's men on motorcycles started chasing Dan's car. Soon after, Dan turned up the music so his family wouldn't realize what was happening. Max the baby stayed awake and laughed, seeming to know his dad could handle the bad guys. Suddenly, one of McCaffrey's men trying to shoot Dan, and Dan shot back, hitting one of them when another criminal got close and grabbed onto the car. Dan knocked him out by putting Max's milk bottle into the criminal's helmet, which fell onto the road. Meanwhile, Dan got rid of the last criminal by crashing his car into the criminal's motorcycle, causing him to collide with a billboard. Jessica woke up after hearing the explosion, but Dan lied and said they hit a pothole because Dan had been driving all night. He decided to stop at a plantation to rest, but when he was about to fall asleep, Nina woke up and realized they were in Iowa. She asked her dad to take her to Southern Iowa University, which was where she wanted to go. After some arguing between Jessica and Nina, Dan finally agreed to take Nina to campus. While walking in the campus park, Kyle, who was with Nana and Max, mentioned that their families seemed to disapprove of her relationship with Trevor. Because he had changed, Kyle added that he liked the old Nina, who was warm with their family. Hearing that, Nina smiled and thanked her younger brother because she didn't expect him to care so much. Meanwhile, Dan listened to Jessica talking about her past as a pole vault athlete and how she had to give up her dream after an injury. Dan wanted to share his own past but changed his mind when he saw a suspicious man with a suitcase. He approached the man, who turned out to be a corn seed businessman from Germany looking for his daughter on campus. When they passed by laboratory, Dan didn't believe the man's story, so he spoke to him in German to make sure he wasn't one of McCaffrey's men. Jessica was surprised that her husband could speak German and left the hallway. Eventually, Dan believed the man when he showed his suitcase filled with corn seeds. At the same time, one of McCaffrey's men tried to shoot Dan. Dan quickly entered the laboratory and a fight broke out between them. Dan managed to defeat McCaffrey's men. On the flip side, Nina was staying in the dorms at school and accidentally walked into Trevor's room. She was shocked to find him with another girl when she discovered that her boyfriend was cheating on her. Nina decided to teach Trevor a lesson and break up with him. Sometime later, Nina joined Dan's family on their trip to Las Vegas. When they reached Colorado, Nina took over Dragon from her dad. She apologized to Dan for leaving her school magazine behind and promised to get back her position as the school magazine editor. She also thanked Dan for not telling Jessica about this. The next day, after spending the night in Colorado, Dan contacted Augie and arranged to meet in Las Vegas to get his family's passports. While Dan was at a restaurant, he was planning to tell Jessica about his past, but Kyle approached him to discuss why he preferred being an online gamer. There, Kyle explained that he didn't feel very confident in the real world but felt happy when he played games as Killboy, because many people liked him. Kyle also tried to convince his father that playing games requires intelligence and quick reflexes. He challenged his father to a laser shooting game with a condition that if he won, Dan couldn't stop him from playing games, and if he lost, he would quit gaming. Hearing that, Dan agreed and they went to the laser shooting game area. Little did Kyle know that Dan was skilled with weapons and he easily won the game. This made Kyle feel sad, but Dan tried to cheer him up by giving him a hug. When Dan and his family arrived in Las Vegas, they went to their hotel room and Dan met Augie at the bar to get their new passports and flight tickets to Vancouver. Later, Dan returned to the room and prepared for dinner with Jessica, making sure to have some weapons just in case. Before leaving, he told his kids not to leave the room or open the door for anyone. However, Kyle, Nina and Max sneaked out of the room to explore the hotel's online gaming area. Meanwhile, one of McCaffrey's men spotted Dan and his family in Las Vegas and reported it to his boss. Back at the gaming area, Kyle met a professional gamer named Ren who invited him to meet other gamers in a restaurant. Dan tried to reveal his past to Jessica, but because the waiter spoke in French, Dan replied in French and unintentionally shared his story with Jessica, who couldn't understand him but praised him anyway. As for Kyle, he was getting ready to play an online game after Ren asked him to replace him, as Ren wanted to approach Nina. Little did they know that McCaffrey's men were secretly watching them from a distance. While Jessica and Dan had finished the dinner and returned to the hotel, they didn't realize that their child was missing from their room. Around the same time, some of McCaffrey's men entered the room and attempted to harm Dan. Using his skills, Dan managed to immobilize two of the intruders, but he quickly lowered his weapon when McCaffrey's subordinate named Coogan held Jessica hostage. Dan seized an opportunity and threw a knife that hit Coogan in the eye, freeing Jessica soon. After Jessica hurriedly went to her children's room and discovered that Nina and the others had left, that she decided to search for them at an online gaming place while scolding Dan for keeping something from her, even mentioning that she didn't want to see him again. Meanwhile, Kyle eventually won the online game match and became the game's MVP. Shortly after, Jessica and Dan arrived at the gaming area to pick up Kyle and the rest once they were in a safe place. Dan finally disclosed his past as a secret killer who had escaped from his group to start a new life as an ordinary citizen. Since then, he had been pursued by Caffrey and his men who wanted to eliminate him. Kyle and Nina, upon hearing the story, burst into laughter until gunshots were fired at them. Dan quickly led his family to take cover in a casino. He tried to incapacitate McCaffrey's men, but unfortunately his shots couldn't harm them, because they were wearing bulletproof vests. Soon after, Dan continued trying to divert the attention of McCaffrey's men and eventually defeated them. After that incident, Dan confessed to his family that his real name was Sam. He had been in the military and was recruited by Caffrey for a special mission to eliminate criminals who couldn't be touched by the law. However, he discovered that Caffrey was just using him to kill people for a high fee, so he decided to escape Caffrey, then began hunting him down. Because of that, Sam provided new identity passports to his entire family, but Kyle and Nina were upset because they believed Sam had messed up their lives. Hearing that, Jessica was also angry and felt deceived after 18 years of marriage to Sam, so she contacted Gwen to arrange a vacation to get away from Las Vegas. When Jessica and her children met Gwen, they were surprised to find out she had prepared a private jet for them. On the plane, Gwen shared a story about her ex who lived in Buffalo and had married someone else. Hearing this, Jessica became suspicious that Gwen was talking about Sam. Upon arriving at their destination, Jessica planned to go with her children, but they were suddenly confronted by Caffrey. Unexpectedly, Gwen had trapped Sam's family to hand them over to Caffrey in exchange for getting Sam back. Caffrey then took Jessica and her children hostage to force Sam to meet him alone at a casino. Soon after, Caffrey contacted Sam and threatened to harm Sam's family if he didn't follow McCaffrey's orders. When Dan reached the casino, McCaffrey's men were using a drone to keep an eye on his arrival. Inside the casino, Dan met a man named Spiros who guided him to the room where Caffrey was holding his family captive. Once inside, Caffrey welcomed Dan, and during their conversation it was revealed that McCaffrey was actually Dan's biological father. He felt disappointed because Dan had chosen to leave him several years ago. There, Caffrey asked Dan to return as his top assassin, but Dan refused, so he ordered Gwen to shoot Jessica, fearing for his family's safety. Dan agreed to comply with his father's wishes on the condition that McCaffrey would ensure his wife and children's safe return to Buffalo. Hearing that, Caffrey agreed, and Spiros invited Jessica and the others to leave the room. While in the elevator, Jessica cleverly used Max's diaper to distract Spiros and push him off the top floor. They then hurried back to rescue Dan. Inside the room, Dan managed to beat Gwen, allowing his family to leave. Meanwhile, Caffrey sensed something was weird and ordered his men to repair. At that time, Dan instructed Jessica and the children to go to the roof of the building and hand the drone to Kyle, who could help monitor McCaffrey's men. As for McCaffrey's men, who had been waiting in front of the elevator to capture Dan and his family, they only found Max's equipment. Back inside, when they checked it, a bomb exploded, catching them off guard. At the same time, Dan started defeating McCaffrey's men one by one with Kyle's help, who told him where the opponents were. At that time, Gwen also woke up and McCaffrey called her on the phone, ordering her to find Kyle, who was operating the drone. Back to Dan, he aimed his gun at McCaffrey from upstairs and asked his father to stop everything. But Caffrey ordered his men to shoot at Dan, and he tried to dodge all the shots. On the roof of the building, Jessica told her children to hide and confronted Gwen, who had made her way to the roof. In the game room, Dan started having trouble reading the opponent's moves. After Caffrey shot down the drone controlled by Kyle, returning to the roof, Gwen seemed to easily overpower Jessica and intended to harm Kyle and the others. Seeing this, Jessica got up and tried to climb to the top floor using a bamboo pole, but it broke and Gwen laughed at her. Soon after, Jessica grabbed a broken piece of bamboo and threw it at Gwen, accidentally causing Gwen's death. Back to Dan, he faced off against Caffrey, and just before Caffrey could shoot Dan, Nina, who had arrived with the others, called Mac Caffrey her grandfather and asked him to stop. Hearing that, Caffrey got distracted and he gave Dan a chance to attack him until he passed out. Turns out Nina had done this to give Dan more time to survive. In the end, Caffrey was finally imprisoned for his various criminal activities. As for Mana, she achieved her dream of becoming a news reporter, while Dan opened a company offering security advisory services to banks, and Jessica realized her dream of becoming an athletic trainer at a school. In their free time, Dan's family went on road trips together with a rule that no one could use cell phones during the trips. They all seemed to enjoy every moment of their family trips.